Howdy, y'all. Welcome back to the Sanctified Podcast. Today's show, I want to cover a saint that was recommended to me and I found pretty interesting. And there is some certain circumstances around this saint that we'll get into later on. But for now, let's start talking about Saint Herman of Alaska. All right, so right off the bat, I want to go over what makes Saint Herman so different from other saints that I've covered. And that is that he is recognized as a saint by the Orthodox Catholic Church, but not the general Catholic Church. Now, I think his story warrants his status and that he is absolutely capable of becoming a globally recognized saint. As it is now, he hasn't officially been canonized, but he has been glorified, and there have been churches that have been constructed in reverence to him. He was also the first official saint of the Orthodox Church of America, and I think that lends itself to give his story credit and include him in the Sanctified Podcast. Now, I did say that when I started this series, I wanted to help people not only learn about saints, but also help find their saint for confirmation if they are going through that. And now to kind of answer the question that raises up is, does Saint Herman count for confirmation in the Catholic Church since he's glorified but not canonized? And the answer is, look, it kind of. Technically, he's supposed to be reconciled by the Catholic Church before they will allow him to be an option for confirmation. However, if you're confirmed in the Orthodox Catholic Church, he is fully permissible to be a confirmation saint, and the Catholic Church will recognize your confirmation in the Orthodox Catholic Church so he can be a confirmation saint in certain circumstances. Now, if you do want Saint Herman to be your confirmation saint, I wouldn't suggest joining the Orthodox Church just for that reason, but I felt that it was important to include there. And also, there's a chance that he will be allowed for your confirmation from the research that I performed. Well, it may not be a traditional way. There are some instances where individuals were allowed to have Herman as their confirmation saint because they were granted special permission. All right, so now that we have some of that technical information done, let me get to the good stuff, the story and the life of Saint Herman. Saint Herman was born in 1756, though some sources suggest that it was 1760, into a family of merchants in Serpukhov, Russia, which was part of the Moscow diocese. His birth name was lost to history, so only his monastic name is known. He began his monastic life at the young age of 16. He started at the Trinity Sergius Hermitage near the Gulf of Finland and about 10 miles from St. Petersburg. While at the Hermitage, Herman was graced with his first miracle, one that saved his life. He had an abscess on the side of his throat, and while this disfigured his face, appearances were the least of his concern. As times went on, the abscess grew, and it became harder for Herman to swallow food, and the smell it gave off was apparently very dreadful. Herman embraced his inevitable demise, and he locked himself in a cell with an icon of the Holy Virgin Mary. He took a towel, wet it, and wiped the face of Mary before placing the towel over his throat. Herman then started praying. He prayed until he fell asleep, with tears streaming down his face because he thought his end was near. In his sleep, he was visited by the Virgin Mary, and she healed him. When he awoke, the abscess was gone, and all that remained was a small mark on his neck, a reminder of the pain that he endured and the power of the faith that healed him. Herman continued to live at the Hermitage for about 5 more years. Then he transferred to Valam Monastery. At the Valam Monastery, Herman found deep respect and admiration for the elder of the monastery, Father Nazarius, and Herman was equally respected by everyone else at the monastery. Herman was granted permission to live in the woods outside, but he would return on holy days and sing with the choir in the monastery. All of this was going on around the same time that Russia was establishing fur trades in Alaska, and in 1794, Gregory Shelikov requested a mission be sent to, quote, his land in Alaska. He had started the Russian-American Company, which was a leading fur trade company in its era, and he felt that the local inhabitants needed Christianity and that he was in the right position to bring it to them. Now, whether or not it was the right thing to do to force his faith on the local population, it happened, and there's not much point in getting into the morality of something that happened centuries ago right now. That's not the point of the Sanctified Podcast. I think you'll find, just as I did, that it actually ended up being pretty successful. And that's more because the traders' plan backfired. They were actually fairly abusive to the locals and didn't expect the missionaries to care for whatever reason. Now, of course, the missionaries did care, and the locals respected them and followed them for that. There were a total of 10 men who were selected to go on the mission to these islands, and among them was Herman. It is recorded that they converted several thousand people and built a school for newly baptized children to attend. They also built a church nearby to support their exponential growth. But this resounding success was short-lived. By the early 1800s, every one of the other missionaries perished either through drowning on a capsized ship or sickness or other various means. And eventually, only Herman survived of the original 10. And he continued his mission steadfastly. Herman decided to settle on Spruce Island, and he would call it New Valam. Some sources say that he might have moved here for his own safety, as there's a conspiracy about an assassination attempt being planned for Saint Herman. But Spruce Island is about a quarter mile from Kodiak Island, where they had previously built a monastery for the missionaries. He started with a simple cave that he worked to excavate himself, and eventually a house and a chapel were built on the island, and he started a garden to grow food for himself. He grew potatoes and other various vegetables in the summer, and in the harsh winters, he had preserved mushrooms with salt from the ocean. He used seaweed to cover and fertilize his garden and had a wicker basket to carry it in. Now, this may seem to be some menial information, but witness accounts say that the basket was large enough to appear to require 2 men to carry it. Herman was also seen carrying a log that would normally need 4 men or more to move, but he never had help, nor did he ever ask others to help him. He was just able to accomplish these incredible feats all on his own. He used anything in excess of what he needed to help take care of the orphans in the area. Herman lived an extremely humble and honestly an uncomfortable life. He would constantly help those around him, but never asked for anything in return. He wore the same deerskin parka for years on end, and he would sleep on a table covered in deerskins with bricks for a pillow and a piece of wood for a blanket. He believed that living so humbly was a great sign of respect for God. Now, it does sound a little excessive, but his faith led him to live like this, and I must admit, it seems to have worked out for him. Like, he's a saint now, so at least a saint in the Orthodox Church, and so he must have lived a fulfilling life. Once, when asked about his lifestyle and being alone, he responded with, "I am not alone. God is here, as God is everywhere. The holy angels are there. With whom is it better to talk, with people or with angels? Most certainly with angels." You know, he's got a pretty good point with that. Now, there are many other stories of the teachings that Herman did at his little school on Spruce Island, but my favorite is about Herman meeting the crew of a Russian frigate. I'll share a condensed version of the story. So, a crew arrived to investigate the colony of Alaska, and Herman met with them and asked them a very simple question. What do they want to be happy? They gave all sorts of answers: money, power, fame, family, a ship of their own. But Herman then went on to talk about God and how everything comes from him. And so he asked if they love God. Now, they unanimously responded, yeah, we love God. But when Herman described loving someone, they realized that their love was incomplete. Even Herman admitted his love for God was incomplete. Eventually, they parted ways. But Herman undoubtedly left an impact and quite possibly changed a few of that crew's lives. Having such success with converting native Aleuts, the local governor started to get angry. He sent a letter to St. Petersburg to force Herman to go back, but nothing ever came of it. In fact, the same governor would go on to become an admirer of Herman himself. However, that wasn't before a team of inspectors was sent to investigate Herman's home. They expected to find valuables that they could claim from Herman, but they found nothing, as Herman was a modest and exceedingly simple man, as we've already been over. One of the inspectors tore up the floor with an axe to search for something in vain. Herman told that man, "My friend, you have lifted the axe in vain. This weapon shall deprive you of your life." And later, when men were needed at Fort Nichols to fight against the natives of Kenai, that same inspector who tore up the floor was killed by the Kenai people. Was it foresight that Herman had and warned the man about it? Or was it just a coincidence? It's up for you to decide, but we'll get into some more of Herman's fortune telling and possible miracles. But let me just share one more thing before we get into that. So real quick, before we continue, Herman that admitted once to one of his disciple Gerasim, that when he arrived in Alaska, evil approached him in various forms and tempted him to sway from his virtuous path. Because of that, Herman decided that he would not speak to anyone who came into his presence before they said a prayer. Now, this might seem a little rude to ignore someone who may not realize his history, but if his experiences were true, I feel like it is kind of justified at the same time. Now, I just found this to be an interesting little tidbit, and I wanted to include it. It's another demonstration of how seriously Herman stood in his faith and how dedicated he was. Okay, so back to the good stuff. There's a few accounts of Herman predicting the future and performing other near miracles. I will admit some of these could have other explanations, could have just been coincidences, albeit they may stretch that a little bit. The first I will mention is Herman is said to have befriended all of the animals and plants on Spruce Island, and when he passed, the animals left, and the garden would bear no more food, despite the effort put into it. Now, if you spent a while in nature, and you spent quite some time perfecting a gardening technique, this could make sense that nobody could just walk in and replace Herman. But without knowing more details, I couldn't say if it is that simple. Now, another one is Herman saying that there will be a bishop for America because it didn't exist at his time. Obviously, we know it came true, but I can understand the argument that it was essentially just a matter of time before one was instilled. But in their time, it was still kind of up for debate. Like, does it make sense to do that or not? His more profound miracles include stopping a flood, stopping a fire, predicting the unification of the Aleuts, and predicting the promotion of a Navy officer. Now, I'm going to elaborate on each one of those a little bit, starting with the promotion of a Navy officer. So, Herman asked for someone to help him write a letter. Baron Wrangel helped Herman write his letter, and Herman dictated what he wanted written since he couldn't write in English. And upon completion, Herman congratulated the Baron on becoming an admiral. The Baron first thought Herman was confused because he wasn't an admiral, but a few weeks later, he received notice of his promotion to admiral. Now, the next one is the unification of the Aleuts. So before Herman died, he said that there would be an epidemic and many would die, so many that the Aleuts would be united by the colony's government. Well, less than a year after Herman died, a smallpox epidemic broke out and decimated the local Aleut villages. Some villages were nearly wiped out entirely. The 12 villages were then grouped into 7. Now, for the next miracle, stopping a fire, this is when a fire broke out on Spruce Island where Herman resided, and Herman went with his disciple, Ignati, to the edge of the forest. There, he pulled back a blanket of moss about a yard wide, and he turned it over. Herman said the fire would not pass this point. Well, guess what? The fire did not pass that point. And the last one is when Herman stopped a flood. Spruce Island, yet again, was in peril, and it was flooding, or at risk of flooding. So the locals were scared, and they went to Herman for help. Herman brought an icon of the Virgin Mary to a bank near the village, and he placed it down. He said a prayer, and he told them that the water would not rise past that icon. You probably could guess what happened next. The water never passed that icon. The icon is kept to this day on Spruce Island, and it has been used on other times to protect the island, which I think is a very interesting thing to take note of. Now, I do have one more that I want to include, but it doesn't quite fit the same mold as the others, and it's a better demonstration of Herman's unwavering faith. At one time, a ship arrived in nearby Sitka and moved on to Kodiak Island, but it left behind a plague of sorts in its wake. People who got sick almost certainly died within 3 days, and it was so contagious, nobody was able to keep up with burying all of the bodies. Herman, he didn't care though. He visited the sick, he prayed for them, he brought them penance, prepared them for death, anything else that the sick needed or asked for, he was there to help. Now, this is where you'd expect me to say everyone he visited recovered, but that isn't the case. However, despite visiting the sick and dying ceaselessly, Herman never got sick himself. Was he just lucky? Was it divine protection? You can decide for yourselves. I know what I'm leaning towards, but I don't want to sway your minds. The final event I want to go over is Herman's death, which makes sense. It's the final event because it's Herman's final event. But the interesting thing to me is that they're fairly accurate records of Herman, but his death has some debate around it. Some suggest he died December 25th, 1837. Others say it was November 28th and he was buried in December. But that's not the really interesting part. The interesting part is that after he died, the colony's leader told them to wait to bury Herman until he could get there and bring a fine coffin for Herman. The people waited for him, and after a month of bad weather and the leader being unable to come, the wait was finally over, and they buried Herman. But over this time, his body did not degrade, nor did it give off any sort of foul odor. In fact, some who saw Herman's body right after he died said it smelled rather nice, which we've heard before for other saints. So that's pretty impressive stuff. It's pretty good for pushing his story that he deserves to be a saint in the broader Catholic Church. But that's not all. In a village nearby, Kitani, some residents saw a pillar of light over Spruce Island, and the elders said, "It seems that Father Herman has left us." And a short while later, they learned that he had indeed died that very night. Another settlement on Afognak said that they saw a man rising into the sky over Spruce Island on the night of Herman's death. There are multiple accounts from multiple individuals across multiple villages that something appeared in the sky that night, which is pretty astounding. As time wore on, people would pray to Herman and ask for help from God through him. A sailor in a particularly bad storm once prayed to Herman and was sure his vessel would sink if the weather did not improve. So he asked Herman that if he is truly in God's presence, please change the wind. Not 15 minutes later, the wind changed and the man reached shore safely. Herman was glorified on August 9th, 1970, and August 9th is his commemoration date, which would be the Orthodox Church's equivalent to canonization and feast days for the Catholic Church. As always, I encourage reasonable discussion in the comments or with those around you about Father Herman. Which of his miracles do you truly believe were miracles? Which do you think might have just been coincidences or have some other explanation? Do you think he deserves to be canonized? If so, or rather, if not, why don't you think so? Because I feel like there's a pretty good argument for why he could be. If you have any other suggestions on these saints that you think I should check out, feel free to drop them in the comments or email them to me at SanctifiedPodcast@proton.me. If you enjoyed listening to this, I appreciate any support with liking, commenting, subscribing. I have a YouTube channel, which is the Sanctified Podcast. I'm on Apple Music, Amazon Music, Podbean, and a few other podcasting services. So thank you for your time. Take care. And I hope you have a wonderful day.